The lottery ticket trembles in Harold Pemberton's hand, not from doubt, but from the Parkinson's he can't control. 5 numbers match, plus the bonus, $847, enough to fix the roof, enough to see their daughter in Oregon after 2 years apart. At the Quick Mart counter, Ruth watches her husband of 40 years slide the ticket through the gap in the bulletproof glass with the same care he once used grading his students' geometry proofs. They've dressed for this moment, Harold in his Navy teaching blazer, Ruth in her cream cardigan. Lottery winners deserve dignity, even small ones like them. The clerk scans it, looks at them, tears it in half. Already redeemed, he says, his eyes flat as concrete. Yesterday. Fraud's a crime, folks. The pieces flutter into the trash. 40 years of playing the same numbers, their wedding date, their daughter's birthday, the address of their first home, reduced to confetti. In their car, silence presses against the windows. Harold's hands shake harder now. Not just the disease, rage, or grief. Perhaps both feel the same at 71. But here's what the clerk with the dead eyes couldn't see. Ruth Pemberton spent 4 decades teaching teenagers how to identify patterns in chaos. Harold can still calculate probability in his sleep. And when Javon Mitchell, the night stock worker who witnessed everything, follows them to the parking lot with a phone number and a story about his grandmother, something shifts. Sometimes the theft isn't what they take. It's what they believe you won't fight to reclaim. Have you ever known something was wrong? Been absolutely certain? Only to watch everyone else accept the lie? Stay with us. Because what happens when 2 retired teachers, a combat veteran with nothing to lose, and a grandmother who's carried shame for 6 months too long, decide that already redeemed isn't where this story ends? That's when the real numbers start adding up. The oatmeal bubbled on the stove, a sound as familiar to Ruth Pemberton as her own heartbeat. She stirred clockwise 3 times, habit from 40 years of morning routines, while Harold sat at the kitchen table behind her, head bent over the lottery playslip. His pen moved slowly, not from deliberation, but from the tremor. Ruth didn't turn around. She'd learned that watching made it worse, made him self-conscious about hands that had once drawn perfect geometric proofs on chalkboards, that had held her steady through 4 decades of marriage, that now betrayed him with their shaking. 06-14-1983, Harold murmured, filling in the first numbers. Their wedding date. Ruth smiled despite herself, reaching for the brown sugar. The June ceremony at St. Mary's, her mother crying through the vows. Harold in a rented tux that was slightly too short in the sleeves. 09/22/1989. Emma's birthday. Their daughter, now 38 and 3,000 miles away in Portland. An engineer for some renewable energy company Ruth could never quite explain to her church friends. They'd Skyped last Sunday. Emma's face pixelated and distant, her apartment visible behind her, sleek and modern, and nothing like the cluttered warmth of this kitchen. When did we last see her? Ruth asked, though she knew. 2 years? September. 2 years. The words sat heavy between them. Emma had invited them to visit for Christmas, but the plane tickets alone were $900. And then there was Harold's medication, and the roof. The bucket by the window caught another drip. Plop! Ruth ladled oatmeal into bowls, added their precise portions of brown sugar and cinnamon. Harold was filling in the last numbers now, 1 to 2, 4, 7. The address of their first house, the little Cape Cod on Maple Street, where they'd brought Emma home from the hospital, where they'd hosted backyard barbecues and painted walls and learned how to be parents. They'd sold it when Harold's father got sick, used the profit for his care. No regrets. But sometimes Ruth drove past it, and felt the ache of younger years. You know what? Harold set down the pen, his hand steadier now that the task was complete. Today feels lucky. Ruth brought the bowls to the table. You say that every Tuesday. And one Tuesday, I'll be right. His eyes crinkled at the corners, the smile that had won her over at that teachers' union meeting in 1982, when he defended her proposal for updated science equipment with statistical evidence that made the board president actually listen. She kissed his forehead, tasting salt and Old Spice and home. He ate quickly, eager as always on Tuesdays. The walk to Quick Mart was only 3 blocks, but lately he'd started leaving earlier, taking his time. Pride kept him from asking her to drive him, and love kept her from offering. I'll start the laundry, she said, as he shrugged into his navy blazer, the one he'd worn for 30 years of parent-teacher conferences, now slightly threadbare at the elbows. He tucked the play slip carefully into his shirt pocket, next to his heart. If we win big, we'll fix the roof first. Then plane tickets. Oregon, Ruth said softly. Oregon, he agreed. The door clicked shut behind him. Through the window, she watched him navigate the front steps, gripping the railing, his gait slower than it had been even 6 months ago. But his shoulders were straight, his head high. The Parkinsons could take his steadiness. It couldn't take his dignity. Ruth turned back to the dishes, to the ordinary Tuesday morning stretching ahead of her, and couldn't know that in 3 hours, everything ordinary would shatter. Harold stood at the lottery checker mounted beside the Quick Mart entrance, last week's ticket trembling between his fingers. The morning sun caught the metallic surface of the machine, making him squint as he carefully aligned the barcode. He'd done this hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Every Tuesday for a decade, the same ritual: buy this week's tickets, checked last week's numbers, acknowledged the loss with a philosophical shrug, walk home. The routine was the point, not the winning. The machine beeped, once, twice, then a sound he'd never heard it make, a triumphant cascade of electronic chimes. Congratulations, 847 Harold's breath stopped. His hands shook harder, adrenaline flooding through him like electricity. He stared at the screen, certain he'd misread it, certain the Parkinson's was affecting his vision now too. But the numbers didn't change. $847,000. He checked the posted winning numbers on the wall, his fingers struggling to hold the tickets steady enough to compare. 06, 14, 1983, 09, 22. 5 matches, plus the bonus number, 47, their house number. A laugh burst from him, sharp and disbelieving. An elderly woman entering the store smiled at the sound, and Harold wanted to grab her shoulders, shake her gently, tell her that hope wasn't foolish after all, that sometimes the universe remembered you existed. $847. The roof. The leak that had turned their guest bedroom into a bucket repository, that kept them both awake during storms, worrying about rot and mold and collapse. The contractor had estimated $800 for the repair. And plane tickets. Round trip to Portland, if they caught a sale, if they flew on a weekday, if they were willing to have a layover in Denver. His mind raced through calculations, probabilities, possibilities. Years of teaching geometry had trained him to see angles and solutions. And right now, every angle pointed toward Oregon, toward Emma's apartment with its sleek countertops and view of Mount Hood, toward his daughter's face, not pixelated but real, toward 2 years of distance, finally closing. Harold placed the ticket carefully, so carefully, into his shirt pocket. The paper felt impossibly fragile, as if it might dissolve from the moisture of his palm. He walked into the store, bought this week's tickets from the clerk behind the bulletproof glass. A young man with neck tattoos who barely looked up from his phone, and walked home faster than he'd moved in months. The kitchen smelled like fabric softener. Ruth was folding towels at the table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, NPR murmuring from the radio on the counter. "You're back early," she said without looking up. Harold pulled the ticket from his pocket and placed it on top of the towel pile. Ruth glanced at it, then at him. Something in his face made her set down the towel she was folding. "Harold, check the numbers." She picked up the ticket with the same careful reverence he'd used, walked to the computer in the corner, their ancient desktop that took 3 minutes to boot up, and pulled up the lottery website. Harold stood behind her, close enough to smell her lavender shampoo, his heart hammering. Ruth's finger traced across the screen, matching numbers. Once, twice, a third time. Then she turned in the chair, looked up at him with eyes suddenly bright, and said in a voice that broke in the middle, "We won." The roof, Harold thought, watching his wife cry with relief. The plane tickets. Maybe even new tires for the Camry. They were going to see Emma. They returned to Quick Mart at 11:15, holding hands like teenagers on a first date. Ruth had changed into her cream cardigan, the one she wore to church, to parent-teacher conferences back when she still taught, to occasions that required her best self. Harold's navy blazer still smelled faintly of chalk dust, though he'd been retired for over a year. "We're lottery winners," Ruth whispered as they crossed the parking lot, and Harold squeezed her hand. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Tyler stood behind the bulletproof glass, alone, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of someone counting minutes until a shift ended. The store smelled like hot dogs rotating on metal rollers and cleaning solution. Ruth approached the counter first, sliding the ticket through the gap with both hands, treating it like the precious thing it was. "We'd like to claim this, please." Tyler didn't look up immediately. He set down his phone with deliberate slowness, picked up the ticket, scanned it under the reader. The machine beeped once, twice. He studied the screen. Then his eyes, flat, dark, utterly empty, lifted to meet theirs. "Says here this was redeemed yesterday at 3:47 p.m. The words took a moment to register. Harold's mouth opened, closed. "That's impossible. We just checked the numbers this morning. We've had the ticket in our..." Tyler tore the ticket in half. The sound, crisp, final, silenced Harold mid-sentence. Then Tyler tore it again, quarters. The pieces fluttered from his fingers into the wastebasket below the counter. "Fraud's a crime, folks." His voice was flat as his eyes. "You want me to call the police?" Ruth's hands pressed against the glass. "Wait. Please, we have the stub. We can prove when we bought it. We've been playing these numbers for 30 years. I said it's redeemed." Tyler's hand moved toward something under the counter. A button, red. "Leave, now." An elderly woman behind them in line took a step backward, clutching her purse. Another customer by the coffee station glanced up nervously. Harold's hand found Ruth's elbow. "Come on." "No." Ruth's voice rose. "This isn't..." "Ruth!" Harold's grip tightened, not forceful, but urgent. His teaching voice, the one that had quieted rowdy classrooms. "We're leaving." Outside, the November air felt sharp after the store's stuffiness. They walked to their car, a 2006 Camry with a dent in the rear bumper from when Harold misjudged a parking space 2 years ago, and sat. Silence pressed against the windows like a physical thing. Ruth's hands shook in her lap. Harold stared at the dashboard, at the check engine light that had been on for 3 months because the diagnostic alone cost $80. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. The 10 digital clock on the dash ticked from 11:23 to 11:34. Then Harold, gentle Harold, who apologized when he interrupted commercials, who had spent 42 years teaching teenagers that problems had elegant solutions if you just found the right equation, reached for the keys. "No," he said quietly. "This isn't right." He turned the key. The engine coughed to life. "Harold, what are you?" But he was already backing out, already turning the car around, already pulling back into the parking space they'd just left. His hands on the steering wheel weren't shaking from Parkinson's now. They were shaking from rage. The second time they entered Quick Mart, Ruth felt the eyes of other customers tracking their movement. The elderly woman from earlier had left. A young mother with a toddler gave them a wide berth near the candy aisle. Ruth's voice came out steadier than she felt. "We want to speak to the manager, now." Tyler leaned back against the cigarette display, arms crossed. Up close, Ruth could see the neck tattoo, some kind of serpent winding up toward his jaw. "He's at lunch. And I already told you people. You stole from us." Harold's voice cracked mid-sentence, his tremor making the words jagged. "We're not leaving until someone... You threatening me?" Tyler's posture shifted, aggressive now. "Because I got cameras." He gestured vaguely upward, where a surveillance camera hung from the ceiling, its lens dark and lifeless. "And witnesses who'll say you came in here trying to scam the store twice." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Ruth felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but fracturing. The humiliation, the powerlessness, the casual cruelty of being called a criminal when you'd spent 40 years teaching children to be honest. Tyler reached for the phone mounted on the wall. "Hold up, Ty." The voice came from the stockroom door. A man emerged carrying boxes of 2-liter sodas, early 30s, muscular build, wearing an Iraq veteran ball cap pulled low. His name tag read Javan. He set the boxes down carefully, his movements precise. Military bearing, Ruth thought automatically, recognizing it from students whose parents had served. "What's going on?" Tyler's demeanor shifted, his aggressive stance softening slightly. "These folks trying to claim a ticket that's already redeemed. Second time today." Javan looked at the Pembertons. His eyes weren't flat like Tyler's. They were watchful, assessing. "When'd you buy the ticket?" "Last Tuesday." Harold pulled the stub from his wallet with shaking hands. "We've been playing the same numbers for 30 years. We checked this morning, saw we won, came directly here. Let me get Stan." Tyler started to protest, but Javan was already moving toward the manager's office in the back. Something in his posture, the way he held himself, the quiet authority, made Tyler close his mouth. Stan Kowalski emerged 2 minutes later, still chewing a sandwich, mustard visible at the corner of his mouth. 50-something thinning hair, the soft build of someone who'd spent decades behind desks. Ruth explained, showed the stub, described buying the ticket last Tuesday at 10:07 a.m. She remembered because they'd run into their former principal in the parking lot afterward. Stan listened with the expression of someone performing a duty. When Ruth finished, he sighed. "Look, folks, I sympathize, but store policy is clear. The system shows this ticket was redeemed yesterday at 3:47 p.m. There's nothing I can do. You'll need to contact the Lottery Commission if you think there's been an error. We're not mistaken." Harold's voice was quiet but certain. "We know what we had. We know what we won." Stan shrugged, already turning away. I'm sorry. Outside, Javon caught up to them before they reached their car. He moved quickly, glancing back at the store windows. He did this to my grandmother. The words came fast, low. 6 months ago. Different clerk, but same story. Tom $200 ticket. Same already redeemed excuse. She was too embarrassed to fight it. Harold accepted the slip of paper Javon pressed into his palm. A phone number, written in block letters. "Don't let this go," Javon said, and walked back inside before they could respond. Officer Daniels had the expression of someone who'd heard every story twice. He typed with 2 fingers, Hunt and Peck slow, while Ruth and Harold sat across from him, in the cramped interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. "And you're certain about the purchase date?" Daniels asked without looking up from his screen. "Tuesday, November 14th, at 10:07 a.m. Ruth's voice remained steady, her teacher's training kicking in. State facts clearly. Support claims with evidence. "We have the stub. We ran into Principal Matthews in the parking lot afterward. He can verify the time." Daniels finally looked at them. Mid-40s, tired eyes, the kind of cop who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by human cruelty, but not enough to stop feeling worn down by it. "Without the physical ticket, it's your word against the store's system. The Lottery Commission won't pay out based on a stub alone. Security protocol. Too easy to forge." He leaned back in his chair. "You could pursue this in civil court, but you're looking at maybe $2,000 in legal fees for an $847 claim. And that's if you win." Harold's hands tightened on the armrests. Ruth watched the tremors spread up his forearms. "So there's nothing we can do," Harold said quietly. "I didn't say that." Daniels pulled out a complaint form. "I'll file this. Send it to the Lottery Commission. But honestly, these things usually go nowhere. I'm sorry." The drive home felt longer than it was. Ruth stared out the window at familiar streets, the library where they'd taken Emma for story hour, the park where Harold had taught her to ride a bike, the high school where they'd both spent decades, shaping young minds, and everything looked different now, smaller, less certain. At home, she made grilled cheese sandwiches neither of them touched. Harold opened his laptop at the kitchen table, and Ruth recognized the set of his shoulders. The same determination he'd shown 3 years ago when the school board tried to cut special education funding and Harold had spent 2 weeks building an irrefutable case with data and testimony. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Patterns." He found the Lottery Commission complaint form first, filled it out with the methodical precision of someone who'd graded 10,000 geometry proofs. Then he started searching. Quick Mart lottery fraud, lottery ticket theft, elderly lottery winners. The results populated slowly on their aging internet connection. Consumer forums, Better Business Bureau complaints, a Reddit thread with 47 comments. Ruth pulled a chair beside him, reading over his shoulder. The stories were eerily similar. Elderly winners, tickets destroyed, claims of prior redemption, amounts under $1,000. "Here." Harold clicked on a Facebook group. Lottery Winners Support Network. 238 members. The most recent post was from 3 days ago, a woman in the neighboring county describing an experience identical to theirs. Same store chain, same response, same destroyed ticket. Ruth's research instincts activated, that familiar sensation of pieces clicking together, the pattern emerging from apparent chaos. She'd spent 40 years teaching students how to identify it, how to distinguish correlation from causation, how to build evidence-based arguments, how to make the invisible visible. "Harold?" Her voice came out steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "This is systematic." He nodded. already scrolling through posts, his tremor less noticeable when his mind engaged with a problem. Look at the amounts, all under 1,000. All elderly victims, all the same store chain. Ruth pulled out her phone, found Javon's number. The slip of paper he'd pressed into Harold's palm felt like a lifeline now. She texted, "Can we meet tomorrow? We need to talk about your grandmother." The response came within seconds. "Yes, Riverside Diner, 9 a.m. I'll bring what I have." Ruth set down her phone and looked at her husband, whose hands had finally stopped shaking. "We're not too old for this," she said. Harold's expression hardened into something she recognized from board meetings and budget hearings. The quiet mathematician who'd calculated the odds and found them acceptable. "No," he agreed. "We're exactly the right age." Riverside Diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, the kind of place where vinyl booths had been patched with duct tape and the waitress knew everyone's order. Javon arrived precisely at 9, a manila folder tucked under his arm, his movements economical and purposeful, military discipline translated to civilian life. "Mr. Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton." He shook their hands with careful respect, his grip firm but not crushing. Ruth noticed the way he scanned the room before sitting, positioning himself with a clear view of both entrances. Hypervigilance, she recognized from students whose parents had returned from deployments. "Please call us Ruth and Harold," she said, her teacher instincts activating. "Ask questions that draw out capabilities. Tell us about your grandmother." Javon opened the folder with the precision of someone accustomed to presenting intelligence briefings. Inside, photographs of a ticket stub, a wall calendar with a date circled in red ink, a police report stamped insufficient evidence to proceed. Loretta Mitchell, my grandmother, 79 years old, raised me after my parents died when I was 11. His voice remained steady, but Ruth saw the muscle working in his jaw. 6 months ago, she won $200. Same Quick Mart, different clerk. Same story, already redeemed, ticket destroyed. She was too embarrassed to push back. Thought maybe she'd remembered wrong. Harold leaned forward, his tremor noticeable as he pointed to the calendar. She documented the purchase date. She documents everything. Habit from raising 4 kids and a grandson on domestic worker wages. Every dollar accounted for. Javon's pride was evident. "I was deployed when it happened. By the time I got back stateside and she told me, the trail was cold. But I started looking. Found 2 others." He pulled out additional files. David Park, 82, retired postal worker, $650 stolen 3 months ago. Claudia Washington, 76, nurse's aide, $2,300 stolen, nearly lost her apartment when she couldn't make rent. "They'd be willing to meet?" Ruth asked, her mind already organizing spreadsheets, documentation systems, evidentiary frameworks. "Tonight, 7 o'clock, Loretta's apartment." Javon met her eyes. They need to know they're not alone, that someone believes them. That evening, 6 people gathered around Loretta Mitchell's kitchen table in an apartment that smelled like lemon polish and determination. Loretta herself moved slowly, arthritis requiring a cane. But her eyes were sharp as she poured sweet tea into mismatched glasses. "Baby," she said to Ruth, her voice carrying the weight of having lived through Jim Crow and the civil rights movement. "You tell your story first. Then, we'll tell ours." Ruth recounted Tuesday's theft, her voice measured and complete despite the emotion underneath. When she finished, Loretta nodded once, decisively. "Shame," she said. "That's what they count on. Making us feel like we did something wrong. Like we're too old to trust our own memory." She turned to the others. "But we're not alone anymore." Mr. Park opened his binder. 40 years of postal service had taught him systematic documentation. Every receipt, every stub, organized by date with handwritten notes in slightly accented English. Mrs. Washington, demonstrative where the others were reserved, described nearly losing her subsidized housing, her voice rising with righteous anger. The lottery win was supposed to cover my medication co-pays. I got diabetes, high blood pressure. Those pills ain't cheap on a fixed income. Harold, tremor prominent now, asked each person to show their documentation. As they spread papers across Loretta's table, stubs, calendars, receipts, police reports that went nowhere, a pattern emerged with mathematical certainty. Elderly victims, amounts under $1,000, same store chain, tickets destroyed, claims of prior redemption. Ruth took notes in her teacher's handwriting, each detail recorded with academic precision. When the last story finished, silence settled over the table. Not defeat, but the quiet before action. Javon spoke first. So what do we do? Ruth looked at Harold, at Loretta, at Mr. Park's meticulous binder, at Mrs. Washington's fierce determination. We make the pattern visible, she said. We document everything, and we prove this is systematic. Thursday morning, Ruth's kitchen table disappeared beneath spreadsheets. She'd created columns: date, victim name, amount, location, clerk description, outcome. Harold sat beside her, his laptop open to mapping software, color-coding Quick-Mart locations across 3 counties. 5 stores, he said, his voice animated in the way it used to get when explaining probability theory. Look at the complaint clusters, all within a 10-mile radius of senior living facilities. Ruth contacted Sharon Chen, administrator of the Facebook support group. Sharon called back within an hour. Her mother had been defrauded in the neighboring county, same pattern. She'd been quietly documenting cases for 2 years. 43 victims I can verify. Estimated $180,000 stolen. Sharon's voice cracked. But without proof, without the physical tickets, the Lottery Commission says their hands are tied. She emailed Ruth a database. Harold imported it, ran statistical analyses that would have impressed his former students. The pattern was undeniable. Elderly victims, specific zip codes, amounts systematically kept below 1,000, below felony thresholds in most jurisdictions. Friday afternoon, Javon took a personal day from his night stocking job. He and Ruth visited 3 other Quick-Mart locations, posing as customers. His military training showed in how he observed, noting camera positions, disabled. Clerk behaviors, dismissive toward elderly customers. Security protocols, non-existent. At the 3rd store, they witnessed it happen. An elderly man approached the counter with a ticket. The clerk scanned it, frowned, shook his head. Sorry, sir, already redeemed. The man protested weakly. The clerk's hand moved toward the panic button. The man left, shoulders slumped. Outside, Ruth photographed a business card the clerk had given him. A check cashing service charging predatory fees. They're directing victims to loan. Sharks, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. That night, Harold's tremor was severe. The stress, the scope of what they'd uncovered, it overwhelmed his already compromised nervous system. Ruth held his shaking hands across the kitchen table. Maybe we're too old for this, she whispered. Harold looked at her with the same expression he'd worn when testifying against district budget cuts, when defending special education funding, when standing up for students nobody else believed in. That's what they're counting on. That we'll be too tired, too scared, too old to fight. His hands trembled violently between hers. But we're teachers, Ruth. We spent 40 years showing students how to solve impossible problems. This is just another equation. with higher stakes, with people who need us. He pulled up Sharon's database on his laptop. 238 faces in the Facebook group. 43 verified victims. How many more hadn't reported? Hadn't known they weren't alone? Ruth studied the spreadsheet, watching patterns emerge from chaos. Her superpower, making the invisible visible through meticulous organization. "We need media attention," she said. "Someone who can amplify this beyond our kitchen table." Harold nodded. "Kelly Rodriguez, Channel 7 News, the Problem Solvers segment. You think she'd take this on? Only one way to find out." Ruth pulled up the Channel 7 website, found the contact form, and began typing. Her teacher's voice emerged through the keyboard. Clear, evidence-based, compelling. By midnight, the email was sent. They sat in the kitchen, surrounded by documentation that proved systematic fraud, feeling simultaneously powerful and terrified. The response came at 6:47 a.m. "This is Kelly Rodriguez. Can you meet Monday at 10? Bring everything you have." Ruth sent the email to Kelly Rodriguez at 6:47 Saturday morning, when insomnia and purpose collided. She'd watched the Problem Solvers segment for years. Kelly taking on predatory car dealers, sketchy contractors, businesses that targeted vulnerable consumers. If anyone would care about elderly lottery fraud, it would be her. The response came at 7:32. "Can you meet Monday at 10? Bring everything." The weekend became a war room. Ruth organized victim testimonies into a presentation that would have impressed her former research methodology students. Chronological, cross-referenced, annotated with supporting documentation. Harold created visual aids, maps showing store clusters around senior facilities, graphs demonstrating the statistical impossibility of so many redeemed tickets, timelines proving systematic patterns. Javon arrived Sunday afternoon with his military documentation training, photographs taken at precise angles, metadata preserved, chain of custody maintained. Mr. Park contributed his postal service expertise on paper trails and government forms. Monday at Channel 7, Kelly Rodriguez met them in a conference room that smelled like coffee and ambition. 42, daughter of immigrants. She had the energy of someone who'd fought for every story that mattered. "Show me what you have." For 3 hours, they presented. Ruth walked through the database. 43 verified victims, $180,000 stolen. Harold explained the mathematical patterns. Javon displayed his surveillance photographs. Mr. Park's binder provided the procedural backbone. Kelly asked rapid-fire questions, thinking in sound bites and visual narratives. "Can you prove the cameras were deliberately disabled? Do you have victims willing to go on camera? What's the company's response been?" Ruth answered each question with academic precision. Yes, they could prove it. Maintenance records showed functional cameras until 8 months ago. Yes, victims would testify. Loretta, Mrs. Washington, Mr. Park himself. The company's response? Silence. Deflection. Claims of isolated incidents. Kelly leaned back, her journalist's instinct clearly engaged. "This is good, really good. But I need something concrete for a story that will force action. Ideally, catching them in the act, surveillance footage, or internal documents proving systematic fraud." "How long?" Ruth asked. "Weeks, maybe months. These investigations take time." Kelly's expression softened. "But I'm in. This is the kind of story that changes policy." That night, Kelly aired a preliminary segment. "Are you a lottery fraud victim?" No stores named, just questions designed to flush out more victims. The tip line received 47 calls. Kelly texted Ruth at 10:18 p.m., "This is bigger than we thought." but I need smoking gun evidence." Tuesday evening, Ruth and Harold watched the news coverage together. The segment was 3 minutes, barely a sketch of the problem, but enough to plant seeds. The phone rang twice with people Ruth didn't know, victims who'd seen the segment and recognized their own experience. Harold sat quietly through it all. That expression on his face Ruth had learned to recognize over 40 years. The mathematician seeing the solution before the problem was fully articulated. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned from the television, his hands steady in a way they hadn't been for days. When Harold's mind engaged with a problem, the tremor diminished, purpose overriding pathology. "We need to win again." Ruth's stomach dropped. "Harold, no, we can't. Kelly needs smoking gun evidence. We can provide it." His voice was calm, logical, the teacher explaining a proof to a skeptical student. "I can calculate numbers that will win a smaller prize. We document everything: purchase time, clerk identity, witnesses. We attempt to claim it at the same store with hidden cameras. If Tyler repeats the theft, we have him on video. And if he gets violent, if something goes wrong." Harold reached for her hand. "Then we'll have Javon nearby. Mr. Park is a witness inside. We'll be careful." Ruth looked at their kitchen table, covered in victim testimonies, at the faces of people who'd been robbed and silenced. "We need more than careful," she said. "We need a plan." Wednesday morning, their kitchen table became a strategy session. Harold spread lottery payout charts across the surface, his laptop open to historical winning numbers, a legal pad covered in calculations that looked like abstract art. "The lottery uses a pari-mutuel system," he explained, falling into his teaching cadence. "Payouts depend on ticket sales and number of winners. I can't guarantee an exact amount, but I can calculate number combinations likely to produce a prize between $400 and $600. Ruth researched covert recording laws on her laptop. Single-party consent in their state. They could legally record without informing Tyler. The knowledge felt simultaneously empowering and terrifying. Javon arrived at noon, his presence filling the small kitchen with controlled intensity. "I'll be outside in my truck, positioned to see through the front windows. If anything escalates, I'm 30 seconds away." "And Mr. Park will be inside?" Ruth asked. Browsing magazines. Close enough to witness, far enough to not seem connected. Javon's military training showed in how he thought through contingencies, threat assessments, extraction plans. Thursday, Harold studied lottery patterns with the focus that used to drive his students to excellence. He filled pages with probability calculations, cross-referenced against payout structures, built mathematical models that would have impressed his former colleagues. Ruth watched his tremor improve as his mind engaged, the Parkinson's still present but diminished by purpose. She wondered if Tyler understood what he'd done when he targeted them. Not just theft, but awakening something Harold thought he'd lost with retirement and illness: the ability to solve impossible problems. Kelly Rodriguez called Thursday afternoon. "I have a private investigator who works with the station. He can loan you a button camera, tiny, high-quality video and audio." "But Ruth, Harold, are you sure about this? If Tyler suspects anything, if he reacts violently..." "We're sure," Ruth said, though her hands shook as she spoke. Friday morning, they drove to a Quick Mart 12 miles away. Different location, different clerk. Harold's hands trembled so badly, Ruth had to fill in the numbers he'd calculated. 08, 17, 29, 33, 41. "Why these?" she asked. "Low-frequency numbers from the past 6 months. Probability suggests a prize between $400 and $600, with approximately 70% confidence." The clerk processed their ticket with bored efficiency. $2. A slip of paper that might be evidence or might be nothing. That evening, they checked the drawing online. Harold's laptop screen glowed in the dim kitchen. Ruth held her breath as the numbers populated. 8, 17, 29, 33, 41. 5 matches, 500. Exactly as Harold predicted. Ruth stared at the screen, at mathematical proof that her husband's mind remained sharp, even as his body betrayed him. 71 years old, hands that shook, voice that occasionally failed. But the intellect that had taught 42 years of students remained brilliant. "We could stop," she said quietly. "We could give this information to Kelly. Let her investigation proceed without us." Harold looked at her with eyes that had seen 4 decades of her fears and hopes. "If we don't do this, he'll target someone else next week. Someone who doesn't have documentation, who doesn't have Javon, who doesn't know they're not alone." The ticket sat on their kitchen table like a small bomb. Ruth touched it gently. This piece of paper that represented either justice or catastrophe. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "So am I." Harold's hands shook as he reached for hers. "But we're teachers. We spent our lives showing students that fear doesn't excuse inaction." They barely slept that night. Ruth lay beside Harold in the darkness, listening to his breathing, feeling the tremor that persisted even in rest. Tomorrow they would walk into that store with hidden cameras and calculated risk. Tomorrow they would either gather the evidence Kelly needed or discover exactly how dangerous their investigation had become. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Coffee brewing, Harold taking his medication, Ruth checking the button camera the PI had delivered Friday evening. It looked like an ordinary shirt button, innocent and small. But it recorded in high definition. They dressed carefully. Harold in his teaching blazer, the camera positioned perfectly on the lapel. Ruth in her cream cardigan, her phone in her pocket recording audio backup. At 9:47, Mr. Park texted, "In position, browsing magazines near front." At 9:51, Javon, parked with clear sightlines, ready. At 10:03, they entered Quick Mart. Tyler stood behind the bulletproof glass, same dead eyes, same territorial posture. Ruth felt her research training activate. Observe, document. Remain objective even when subjective terror threatened to overwhelm. Harold approached the counter, ticket in his trembling hand. The shake was worse today, stress and Parkinson's compounding. He slid the ticket through the gap. Tyler scanned it without looking at them initially. Then his eyes lifted, recognition flickering. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, another one?" He scanned again, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced ease. Ruth could see the screen from her angle. The ticket showed valid, $500, unclaimed. But Tyler's expression told a different story. "System says this was redeemed yesterday, 4:15 p.m. Ruth's voice shook despite her preparation. "That's impossible. We bought it yesterday evening. We've had it continuously since..." Tyler tore the ticket. Not just in half this time, he shredded it methodically, maintaining eye contact with Harold, each tear deliberate. The pieces fell like confetti into the wastebasket. "You two need to stop trying to scam this store." Harold's voice cracked. "Please, we need that money for..." Tyler reached under the counter. When his hand emerged, it held a box cutter, blade extended slightly. Not brandishing, but present. A message. "Get out." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Or I'm calling cops and telling them you threatened me. I got witnesses." He gestured toward an elderly woman by the coffee station who looked terrified. Mr. Park started forward from the magazine rack but stopped. Escalation could turn this dangerous. Ruth pulled Harold toward the door, her teacher's instinct to protect students now focused on protecting her husband. They walked out into November's sunlight that felt surreal after the fluorescent violence inside. In the car, Ruth couldn't breathe. Full panic attack, her first in 20 years since Emma's near-drowning incident at summer camp. Her vision tunneled, her hands numb, her chest tight with terror that had finally breached her intellectual defenses. Javan was there within seconds, opening her door, his military training including crisis response. "Mrs. Pemberton, Ruth, look at me. Match my breathing." Harold's tremor was violent, his entire body shaking. Not just Parkinson's now. Rage and fear and humiliation coursing through a 71-year-old frame that couldn't process this level of adrenaline anymore. "We got it," Javan said quietly, his hand on Ruth's shoulder until her breathing steadied. The camera got everything. His face, the tearing, the weapon, everything. Ruth sobbed. Great heaving cries that came from somewhere deeper than fear. The humiliation, the powerlessness, the casual cruelty of being treated like criminals when they'd spent their lives teaching honesty. "We're too old," she gasped between sobs. "We can't. I can't." Harold's shaking hand found hers. When she looked at him through tears, his face showed the same devastation, but also something else. The quiet determination that had sustained 42 years of teaching. "The camera captured it all," he said, voice breaking. "We have him now." The victory felt hollow against the terror. They sat in their car in the Quick Mart parking lot, two retired teachers who'd just been threatened with violence and tried to remember why justice mattered more than safety. Saturday evening settled over their house like ash. Ruth hadn't left the bedroom since they'd returned from Quick Mart. Harold sat at the kitchen table. The button camera footage paused on his laptop screen. Tyler's smirk frozen mid-tear, the box cutter visible in his other hand. His tremor had worsened. The medication wasn't helping. Nothing helped when his nervous system decided to betray him like this. Sunday morning, the church bells rang across the neighborhood. For the first time in 17 years, they didn't go. Ruth stared at the ceiling. Harold reheated coffee that had gone cold hours ago. At noon, Javan's truck pulled into the driveway. Harold heard two car doors close. Javan never brought anyone. Through the window, he watched Loretta Mitchell emerge, steadying herself with her cane, her movements slow but determined. Ruth appeared in the bedroom doorway as they knocked. Her eyes were red, her cardigan wrinkled from sleeping in it. She looked older than Harold had ever seen her. Loretta didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to Ruth, took her hand with surprising strength, and led her back to the bedroom. Javan and Harold stood awkwardly in the kitchen until Javan finally spoke. She insisted on coming. Through the bedroom door, Harold could hear Loretta's voice. Not the words, but the cadence. Teaching. Testifying. The rhythm of someone who'd survived worse and refused to stay silent about it. 20 minutes later, Ruth emerged. Her face was still puffy, but something had shifted. She sat beside Harold, pulled the laptop toward her, and pressed play on the footage. They watched it together. Tyler's contempt, the deliberate tearing, the threat implicit in the blade he'd shown them. When it finished, Ruth closed the laptop. "Loretta told me about her granddaughter's graduation," she said quietly. "How she missed it because she couldn't afford the plane ticket after Tyler's colleagues stole her $200. She said she let them make her feel ashamed, like she'd done something wrong, like she was too old to trust her own memory." Harold's hands shook against the table. Ruth covered them with hers. That shame kept her quiet for 6 months, while they kept stealing. Ruth's voice hardened. We have evidence now. Real evidence. And if we stop, someone else gets their ticket torn next Tuesday. Loretta emerged from the bedroom, Javon helping her navigate the narrow hallway. She looked at the Pembertons with eyes that had seen Jim Crow in the civil rights movement, that had buried a husband and raised 4 children and a grandson on wages that never matched the work. Baby, she said to Ruth, you did what I couldn't. You documented it. You proved it. You made the pattern visible. She adjusted her grip on the cane. Now you finish it. Monday morning, Ruth was at the kitchen table before dawn. Harold found her already on the phone with the State Attorney General's office, navigating the automated menu with the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years dealing with school district bureaucracy. Gaming Enforcement Division, she said when Harold raised an eyebrow. They were transferred 3 times. Each time, Ruth explained with academic precision: systematic lottery fraud, documented pattern, button camera evidence, database of victims. On the 3rd transfer, a woman's voice answered with actual interest instead of bureaucratic deflection. This is Agent Lisa Torres. You said you have video evidence? Ruth put the call on speaker. Harold opened his laptop and began uploading the footage. We have more than video, Ruth said. We have everything. Agent Lisa Torres arrived at their house Tuesday afternoon with 2 colleagues and the energy of someone who'd been waiting for this case. She was younger than Ruth expected, late 30s, Latina, wearing a blazer that looked government issue but fit like she'd had it tailored. May I? She gestured toward Harold's laptop. For the next 3 hours, their kitchen table became a war room. Torres watched the button camera footage twice, took notes in a leather portfolio, asked questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and human dimensions of what they were showing her. The blade was a threat, she said. But without him actually stating a threat, a defense attorney will argue he was just holding it while he worked. What we need is the pattern. Ruth slid her spreadsheet across the table. 43 verified victims. Names, dates, amounts, locations. Harold's statistical analysis showing the mathematical impossibility of so many redeemed tickets. Sharon Chen's database from the Facebook group. Javon's surveillance photographs from 3 other Quick-Mart locations. Torres's colleague, a younger agent who'd introduced himself as Marcus Webb, photographed each document methodically. The 3rd team member, whose name Ruth hadn't caught, was already on her phone requesting court orders. This is more extensive than I expected, Torres admitted. She looked at Ruth with something approaching respect. You've done investigative work here, real work. I taught research methodology for 40 years, Ruth said simply. Torres nodded, understanding in her expression. We've been tracking similar complaints across the state. Different chain stores, always elderly victims, always amounts under 3,000. I've suspected organized retail fraud, but we couldn't prove coordination. She tapped Ruth's spreadsheet. This proves coordination. Wednesday morning, Torres called. We pulled Quick-Mart's lottery transaction records through a court order. The data backs your pattern. Clusters of redeemed tickets matching victim complaints, transactions logged but no payout signatures, unusual patterns around senior predominant zip codes. That afternoon, we've subpoenaed their surveillance equipment records. The cameras weren't broken. They were deliberately disabled 8 months ago, 2 weeks after Tyler's first documented theft. Thursday evening, Torres arrived unannounced. Ruth was making dinner, spaghetti, comfort food, Harold's favorite. Javon had stopped by after his shift with garlic bread from the bakery near his grandmother's apartment. Torres accepted coffee, settled at the table with the familiarity of someone who'd been working this case around the clock, and spread out new documents. We've interviewed 15 victims from your database. We've documented systematic targeting of elderly winners. We've proved deliberate camera sabotage. And we've found evidence that store management knew they were giving bonuses for reduced lottery payouts. She looked at each of them. We're ready to move, but I need your help one more time. Ruth felt her stomach drop. What kind of help? A controlled operation. Agent Webb will go undercover as an elderly winner. We'll repair the surveillance cameras without the store's knowledge. If Tyler repeats the theft, and I believe he will, we'll have him on state-monitored video. Harold's tremor intensified. When? Tomorrow, Thursday, 11:30 a.m. Torres met his eyes. You won't be there. You'll be at my office, watching the feed. Safe. Ruth reached for Harold's shaking hand. He'll do it again, Javon said quietly. Tyler thinks he's untouchable. Torres nodded. That's what I'm counting on. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Agent Marcus Webb sat in the Pemberton's kitchen. Gray hair convincing, his movements stiff from an old knee injury that made his elderly persona authentic rather than performed. I've done this before, he said, accepting coffee from Ruth, but never with this much documentation behind it. You've built an airtight case. Torres arrived at 9 with her team. 2 agents for the parking lot, 1 to browse inside as backup. She reviewed the plan one final time, her efficiency reassuring. The surveillance cameras had been repaired without the store's knowledge. Every angle covered, audio crystal clear. At 10:30, they drove to the AG's office. A conference room had been converted into a command center. Monitors showing live feeds from inside Quickmart, radio equipment, Torres at the center coordinating everything. Ruth and Harold sat beside Javon, watching screens that showed the store from 4 different angles. The familiar aisles, the bulletproof glass, Tyler behind the counter scrolling his phone. Agent Webb is approaching, Torres said into her radio. All units hold position. On screen, Webb entered at 11:34. He moved slowly, authentically uncertain, carrying a lottery ticket in hands that trembled slightly. He approached the counter, sliding the ticket through the gap with the careful reverence of someone for whom $750 mattered. Tyler barely looked up, scanned the ticket. The system beeped. Valid, unclaimed, $750 SARS. But Torres, monitoring Tyler's screen remotely, saw what Webb couldn't. Tyler accessing a supervisor override function, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I'm sorry, sir. Tyler's voice carried false sympathy. This ticket was already redeemed, yesterday at 6 p.m. Harold's hands clenched on the conference table. Ruth felt her breath catch. Webb played his role perfectly, confusion, then gentle protest. But I just bought this yesterday evening. I checked the numbers this morning. Are you sure? Tyler's expression shifted to condescension. Maybe you forgot? These things happen. Maybe your wife already cashed it? He spoke slowly, as if to a child. I'm not married. I live alone. I know Tyler tore the ticket. Not quickly, but deliberately, maintaining eye contact, each rip a small violence. He pocketed the pieces and slid a business card through the slot. Quick cash loans. You seem like you need help managing things, buddy. Ruth gasped. Javon's jaw tightened. Harold watched his own humiliation recreated on screen, but this time they had cameras, witnesses, legal authority. At 1:47 p.m., Torres gave the signal. All units move in. On screen, the door opened. Torres entered first, badge high, 3 agents behind her. Tyler's face transformed, shock, then calculation, then rage as he understood. Tyler Hutchins, you're under arrest for lottery fraud, theft by deception, and elder abuse. They watched him being cuffed, still protesting, still claiming system errors. One agent photographed the torn ticket pieces in Tyler's pocket. Another secured the register, preserving evidence. Ruth began crying, not victory, but relief so profound it hurt. Validation. Proof that she wasn't crazy, that Harold's memory was intact. That their 40 years of teaching teenagers to think critically hadn't been wasted because they could still identify patterns and build cases and refuse to be silenced. Javon squeezed Harold's shoulder. The tremor had lessened, purpose steadying what medication couldn't. Torres returned to the command center 30 minutes later, satisfaction evident despite her professional composure. "We have him," she said simply, "and this is just the beginning." Friday morning, Tyler Hutchins sat across from Torres in an interrogation room, a public defender beside him, looking exhausted before 9 a.m. Facing multiple felony charges, Tyler negotiated cooperation with the efficiency of someone who'd always understood cost-benefit analysis. The fraud was larger than anyone had imagined. 40 Quick Mart locations across 5 states. An estimated $380,000 stolen from over 200 victims, primarily elderly. Store managers received quarterly bonuses for reduced lottery payouts, corporate incentive structures that encouraged theft while maintaining plausible deniability. Regional supervisors knew. Some had refined the system. The scheme was elegant in its cruelty. Target elderly winners with visible frailties, tremors, hearing aids, walkers. Keep amounts under $1,000 to stay below felony thresholds. Destroy tickets immediately. Log false redeemed entries. Pocket actual winnings through fraudulent lottery accounts opened with stolen identities. Tyler had specifically chosen victims he believed wouldn't fight back. Too embarrassed, too confused, too tired. He'd been wrong about Ruth and Harold Pemberton. Friday through Monday, Torres's team executed 17 arrests. Clerks, managers, a regional director who'd implemented the bonus structure. Evidence cascaded. Internal emails discussing shrinkage reduction strategies, training documents on handling difficult elderly customers, spreadsheets tracking unredeemed ticket patterns. Kelly Rodriguez's Channel 7 investigation ran as a special report Tuesday evening. Ruth and Harold were interviewed in their kitchen, the table that had become headquarters for Grey Justice, visible behind them. Ruth spoke with academic precision about systematic exploitation. Harold, hands steady in his lap for once, explained how Tyler had weaponized his Parkinson's, using visible disability as a marker for someone who wouldn't be believed. They counted on shame, Ruth said to the camera, on elderly victims feeling foolish, questioning their own memory, being too exhausted to fight bureaucracy. She paused. They were wrong. Wednesday brought the preliminary hearing. The courtroom filled beyond capacity. Loretta, Mr. Park, Mrs. Washington, and dozens of other victims. Javon stood against the back wall in his dress uniform, testimony to military service that now protected civilian communities. Defense attorneys argued procedural technicalities. No individual loss exceeded $2,500. Many victims couldn't definitively prove purchase dates. Ticket destruction was store policy for suspected fraud. Torres countered with the pattern. They chose elderly victims specifically because they believed this population wouldn't have the energy, resources, or confidence to fight back. This wasn't retail fraud. This was predatory elder abuse disguised as policy. She presented Ruth's database, Harold's statistical analysis, victim testimony recorded with Ruth's teacher precision. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just theft, but systematic targeting of vulnerability. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd watched her own mother struggle with predatory lending, denied bail for the regional director. These defendants identified the most vulnerable members of our community and exploited them with premeditation and sophistication. That's not shoplifting. That's organized crime. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the Pembertons. Ruth spoke briefly, Harold beside her, their 40-year partnership visible in how she steadied him while he steadied her. This started with an $847 ticket, Ruth said. It ends with accountability. 6 months later, Tuesday morning arrived with familiar rhythms transformed. Ruth prepared oatmeal while Harold reviewed case files at their kitchen table. Now headquarters for Gray Justice, covered in documentation instead of loneliness. The criminal trials had proceeded swiftly. Tyler Hutchins faced 10 years. Store managers received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years. The regional director, who'd architected the bonus structure, got 12. Quick-Mart Corporation settled civilly. Full restitution to all identified victims plus damages. The Pembertons received their original $847 plus $15,000. They donated it immediately. The Gray Justice Fund, established with Loretta, Mr. Park, and Mrs. Washington, now held $180,000, combining their settlement with contributions from other victims who wanted to help those still fighting. Javon coordinated it, using veteran network connections to provide free legal aid, documentation assistance, and emotional support. Ruth had returned to substitute teaching part-time, but Tuesdays remained sacred. Victim advocacy, pattern documentation, helping elderly people who'd been told they were confused or mistaken to trust their own memory. Harold's tremor had improved, not eliminated. Parkinson's was progressive. But purpose steadied what medication couldn't. He managed the fund's documentation with the same precision he'd once used grading geometry proofs. This Tuesday morning, they walked 3 blocks together. Not to Quick-Mart, which had closed its local franchise, but to Mr. Park Family Market. David Park's nephew had opened it with settlement money, hired Loretta as senior customer advocate. Inside, the store smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Loretta stood near the lottery counter, greeting customers with the dignity of someone who'd survived shame and chosen grace. Harold approached the counter where Mr. Park's niece, Jenny, processed lottery tickets with careful respect. He bought 2 tickets, same numbers, 6-14, 1983, 09-22, 1989, 1247. "Good luck, Mr. Pemberton," Jenny said, and meant it. They checked last week's ticket together. No matches. They smiled anyway. Back home, Javon arrived at 10:30 with coffee and breakfast sandwiches from the Veterans Support Group meeting. He set them on the table between case files and hope. The roof was repaired. Emma had visited last month, saw her parents not as people who needed protection, but as activists who'd protected their community. Christmas in Oregon was planned. Ruth touched Harold's hand. Steady now, or steady enough. They'd become a family forged not by blood, but by shared indignity and the refusal to let theft masquerade as policy. The lottery tickets sat in Harold's shirt pocket. Not desperation now, but ritual reclaimed. The same numbers that had always represented their life together, the moments that mattered, the home they'd built. Sometimes they still won small amounts. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter anymore. They'd already won everything that counted.